Today we will be talking about music from the 20th century. We will focus on 4 composers from this time: Igor Stravinsky, Arnold Schoenberg, John Cage, and Steve Reich. To begin, it is said that Igor Stravinsky stands alongside Schoenberg, Picasso, Le Corbusier, Joyce, and a select handful of others as one of the great trendsetters of the 20th century. Igor Stravinsky was taught by one of Russia's leading nationalist composers, Rimsky-Korsakov, and he collaborated with Diaghilev to produce ballets that have colorful scores, daring harmonies, and such powerful primitive rhythms that audiences were both delighted and shocked. This was one of the first modern styles to succeed commercially and outrage the old guard. With this, his primitive rhythms explored the neoclassical back-to-Bach principles. The term neoclassicism, as applied to music, was not invented by Stravinsky, but he is the composer we associate the word with. It describes compositions of the present century which revive forms, harmonies, genres, and textures from instrumental music of the past, particularly from the period of the 17th and 18th centuries. Some say it is as if Stravinsky were engrossed with the rediscovery of the works of Bach, Haydn, and Beethoven. At this time in his career, he came as close as he ever did to claiming the symphonic tradition of sonata structure, theme, and development, and motto. His neoclassicism is a less direct kind. He would rely more on the reworking of elements of earlier styles, triadic and scalic melody fragments, chordal accompaniments, rhythmic patterns, etc. He molds these into a characteristic style of his own, and the rhythmic element still remains his most recognizable feature. He distances the new from the old, and the conflict and struggle of the work now gets transferred to the audience. As many composers did, Stravinsky uses his music as an outlet. His wit and sarcasm, ritual elements and playfulness were all bound to one end: to objectify history, to destroy time, and to conquer death. His invention of a high order was always motivated by the same thought: to overcome the terror of the conflict of the world by borrowing fragments of history and compressing them into a space which he could explore and command. So, his neoclassical style allowed him to have control over something in his life, remembering the past as well as intertwining the present. Stravinsky's ballets encompass the desire to shock audiences that artists had during the 20th century. The Firebird, completed in 1910, is considered the first great ballet of the 20th century. It was composed for Diaghilev's Russian ballet and is a work of vivid imagination and picturesque orchestration. His skillful deployment of material and rhythmic inventiveness go way beyond anything before him. Its success in both the theater and concert hall have changed Stravinsky's life. Here's a short clip from this ballet, The Firebird. the 20th century, melody became more and more abstruse, and in some cases, not really the point. Stravinsky's ballet, The Rite of Spring, did just that. The Rite is considered the single most famous score of the century. It negated conventional tonality, used pounding rhythms and repetition that was freed from metric restriction, and its morality was offensive. Listeners are often confronted simultaneously with different tonal implications. Frequently, you get pulled to reference points a semitone apart, creating a sense of conflict which, unresolved, induces a continuing tension. As we play this clip from The Rite of Spring, listen for some of these qualities. For most of his creative life, Stravinsky adopted a musical language centered on tonal considerations, in the sense that notes, phrases, and chords were carefully balanced in relation to definite tonic pitches. His use of local tonal centers around which melody and harmony are patterned is similar to the gestural space of a dancer. Like a dancer, Stravinsky can suddenly leap out of this space and into a different tonal area. Stravinsky eventually left this sense of tonality and moved towards atonality with his works. A tonal piece of music is one which has a fundamental tone from which the significance of all other tones comes from and the piece returns to at its conclusion. Atonality is the opposite of this. Stravinsky was highly impressed with Schoenberg's qualities. Schoenberg initially seemed to reciprocate Stravinsky's respect, but he scorned Stravinsky's neoclassical pieces, saying it was a cheap dressing up of the music of the past. Stravinsky's work never lost a sense of his voice, but after Schoenberg's death, he felt able to adopt this idea of serialism.
In order to fully understand this, you will need to know more about Arnold Schoenberg. He is considered the first composer to make a complete break with the system of major and minor keys that has governed Western music since the Renaissance time period, and he was the first to propose a new method of ordering music, 12-tone serialism. Starting around 1899, Schoenberg started a series of works that all broke new ground in the organization of music. Eventually, he reached the conclusion that tonality had been exhausted, which led him to compose his first piece in an atonal style. He opted for atonal music in which there is no dominant key structures, no do-re-mi scale to dictate how harmonies or indeed melodies should progress. Atonality in itself was not a brand new idea, but Schoenberg took the idea further and rebelled against the scale of late Romantic music, working on a severely miniature scale, writing pieces of short length for chamber ensembles. His first major work was titled Verklärte Nacht, or Transfigured Night. It is transformation of themes, complex polyphonic layering, and drama. This piece is even liked by people who didn't like Schoenberg. Schoenberg was often inspired by poems. Transfigured Night was inspired from a poem about a married woman who doesn't really love her husband but is pregnant with his child. She is actually in love with another man. Her true lover says that he will help her and will care for the child as if it was his own. In this piece, and many of his other pieces, Schoenberg is able to use music to distinguish between a male's voice or a female's voice. Try to listen and see if you can notice the differences. Now we will play some of this work for you. By 1915, Schoenberg was interested in exploring whether dissonance could be organized to support musical structures as consonances had been. He took all the notes of the chromatic scale and arrived at the solution of organizing the 12 notes into a particular order or series. This series would be repeated in various ways throughout the piece, so that the series was not the theme of the piece, but the underlying scale of the work. In the 1920s, Schoenberg articulated the rules of 12-tone music, which he claimed would keep German music on top for 100 years. This type of composition took atonality to its logical extreme. Without keys to make certain notes more important than others, each of the 12 notes of the chromatic scale are of equal importance. In other words, a 12-tone piece of music is one that uses all 12 notes on the piano's chromatic scale. They are organized into a particular sequence, which is called a series or row. The series of notes can be used in different ways throughout the piece, but it's important that no one note emerges as more important than any other, becoming a tonic. This style of composition is also known as serialism. In Schoenberg's opinion, this change was greatly needed, as he said himself in 1950. The method of composing with 12 tones grew out of necessity. In the last 100 years, the concept of harmony has changed tremendously through the development of chromaticism. It became doubtful whether a basic toned root remained the center to which every harmonic and harmonic succession must be referred. In addition, Schoenberg, unlike many other composers during his time, liked to write with augmented triads instead of traditional triads. He liked how augmented triads would float ambiguously. An augmented triad is when the fifth in a chord is sharped, which means that it is raised a half step from its normal position. If it was not sharp, it would be a normal triad. The expressive nature of this music became more openly bleak, edgy, and angry, and if Schoenberg's music was the only evidence available, we might conclude that all atonality went along with the expression of predominantly negative emotions. The character of Schoenberg's early surreal music was clear in thematic working and formal movement close to conventional models of texture and structure, but often spiked with irony. Not everyone reacted favorably to atonality. Other composers, like Paul Hindemith, came out strongly against the whole concept, and Richard Strauss was uncomplimentary. As Strauss said in 1913, "The only person who can help poor Schoenberg now is a psychiatrist. I think he'd do much better to shovel snow." Schoenberg's music was not allowed to flourish for long in Germany because the Nazis, in 1933, led to its condemnation as cultural Bolshevism. At one point, Schoenberg was best friends with Richard Gerstel. Because of how little time Schoenberg got to spend with his family, his wife, Mathilde, ended up having an affair with Gerstel. She then went and eloped with him. A crisis ended up happening, and Mathilde came back to her family, leaving Gerstel. This caused Gerstel to burn his paintings and commit suicide. Interestingly enough, Schoenberg also considered suicide during this time. From Gerstel's death, Schoenberg wrote a piece called Erwartung. It is a monodrama about the affair, jealousy, anxiety, and death. This piece was composed in just 17 days. People thought of this piece as psychological because it confused so many. Someone once wrote that the piece takes place in the mind or soul. He used many sounds in his music and in this piece overall. For example, he would use a full-range leap to express a woman screaming as she realizes that the body is that of her lover. Here is the piece. In the new musical era, after 1945 and the end of World War II, atonality and the 12-tone system were embraced with enthusiasm. Schoenberg's appointment to the Prussian Academy of Arts in Berlin was at least a demonstration of official approval. Schoenberg and his closest students Berg and Webern were all beginning to gain a measure of public acceptance, which was a large change from how they were treated a decade before. Schoenberg died in Los Angeles on July 13, 1951, but he had had the satisfaction of seeing his music received with new interest and acclaim in Europe before his end. He knew of the excitement with which young composers were discovering the vast new possibilities that lay within the serial method. Some even declared he had not gone far enough, and over the next 20 to 30 years, the spirit dominated the music establishment. Another important figure is John Cage. He started studying music and taking lessons by 5th grade. He went on to skip many grades and went to college at the age of 16. He later took a trip to Paris and went to a recital by John Kirkpatrick, who played pieces by Stravinsky and Scriabin. He said that this started his love for modern music. He studied first with Henry Cowell and then with Schoenberg. To further his study, he spent 18 months at the Cornish Music Facility. While there, he created a new percussion instrument, organized the first ever percussion-only concert, and began to compose with electronics. He is an American composer, philosopher, and writer on music. Cage rejected the accepted compositional techniques and instead took a radically experimental approach. In the late 1930s, he became active in the organization of concert performances by percussion orchestras, and his first construction is a piece that includes scoring for bells, gongs, anvils, and car brake drums. He called percussion music the art of noise. He is also recognized as the pioneer of the prepared piano. This is where the pitch and timbre are altered by the attachment of objects made of different materials to the strings. Cage composed a well-known piece called Metamorphosis. He also composed Imaginary Landscape No. 1 with piano and Chinese cymbal. Another one of his works, Trio, was written for drums, bamboo sticks, and wood blocks. His composition Quartet is scored for brake drums, tire rims, and kitchen utensils. Cage worked to prove that anything could be music, even something as simple as a kitchen utensil. Another way of doing this was when he would have the piano player pluck the piano strings, or slam the lid of the keyboard, or only slightly press the keys. An example of some of these techniques could be from Cage's piece Living Room Music. In this piece, the musicians are on a stage, but it looks like a living room. There is a table, a pot, papers, and more. The musicians bang on these things and just make music with whatever is in the room with them. Here is a clip from this piece. With his music, Cage tried to change the way composers thought about music and introduced attitudes based on Eastern philosophies. His most famous work is the minimalist piece 4 minutes 33 seconds. It is a piano piece where the soloist is required to sit at the piano for exactly 4 minutes and 33 seconds and play absolutely nothing. He instructed the pianist to open the piano lid at the beginning of each movement, close it again, and then sit there. Cage decided to do this piece after seeing all white paintings of Robert Rauschenberg. Cage believed that everything was music, even silence. He once said, "No silence exists that is not pregnant with sound." Cage is saying that even silence is a sound. He also commented, "And what perhaps most members of the audience experienced as silence," Cage said, "were ambient sounds they ignored. Wind stirring outside, raindrops pattering the tin roof." This piece created a lot of criticism, and many people turned away from Cage. Here is a clip from this piece. Cage's aleatoric principle changes the function of the composer entirely. Aleatoric music has some aspect of the composition left for its performers to interpret. It's also known as chance music. He believed that chance should play a greater part in music, and that the order in which sections or even pages of a work are played should be determined by the throw of a dice or the performer's mood. Now the composer goes from being the creator of a consistent composition to assembling sounds for a performance. Another change Cage made is that he would write the stems of the notes to correspond to the appearance of the sound in time. Now notes all have the same stem length, and we read how long notes are by the actual note head. As an example, an open note head, or circle, would mean that the note lasts for a duration of 2 beats. If the note head is filled in, then the note would last for 1 beat.
Steve Reich is another American composer and one that stands as a key figure in the evolution of more accessible music styles in the post-war years. His compositions rejected the characteristic complexity of mid-20th century classical harmony and tonality. A group of composers led by Steve Reich, Philip Glass, and John Adams developed a style in which simple, small units of melody get repeated over a long period of time, usually linked to detailed rhythms put through small variations. These gradual changes in musical time often get referred to as process music or minimalism. Some minimalistic music creates a spacey ambient sound, which was much of Glass's territory. And other composers went for a more tense, highly motored sound with dense harmonies, which was the approach of Reich and Adams. In the tense, minimalistic music, the underlying rhythms may shift more subtly to introduce tension. Minimalism often involves electronic instruments in addition to normal orchestral instruments, although many European composers made do with just traditional orchestral instruments. Those who stuck to the traditional instruments tended to be wholly minimalists, who aimed to produce visceral emotional impact with large forces that employ soaring but simple melodies over relatively static, uncomplicated chords. Eclectic minimalists often throw bits of other composers' music into the blend and come up with something where rhythm is more direct-driven and tension-provoking. It might involve more jazzy instrumentation and more complicated harmonies. Minimalism is instantly accessible to its listeners and doesn't demand a higher degree in mathematics or musical theory to enjoy. Sometimes people see it as too much of a good thing, almost like an endless loop stretching out to eternity. Reich, however, had many positive effects on others with his minimalistic music. He is one of the leading figures in minimalism and has had a large influence on European musicians like Louis Anderson. Many composers imitate his work, saying that his music sounds remarkably simple in harmonic terms, and melodic features may be no more than a handful of notes. Yet the subtly shifting rhythmic patterns and resultant transformations ensure that the surface of the music is never bland. Reich's early works include 4 organs, completed in 1970, for 4 electric organs and maracas, drumming, completed in 1971, for small tuned drums, marimbas, glockenspiels, 2 voices, whistling, and piccolo, and clapping music from 1972, for 2 pairs of clapping hands. Eventually, he began writing for larger ensembles, and in 1976 he completed Music for 18 Musicians, which is a piece structured around a cycle of 11 vibrantly pulsing chords. It is one of his best-known compositions. We have a clip from Music for 18 Musicians for you to listen to, so you can get a better understanding of what Reich's music is all about. In this clip, you will hear the pulse initially presented by the marimba and piano. Slowly, other members of the group add in. The entire work is around an hour long, so you won't hear all of the chord changes, but in this clip, listen for the change. It's only one chord change, yet it seems so obvious after hearing the same chord for so long. Even though the chord changes, the pulsing rhythm does not, continuing with the beauty of the minimalistic music. Reich's early experiments with tape loops allowed him to observe interlocking rhythmic patterns that he later reproduced compositionally. Some of his works even combine live and tape performers. He drew his inspiration from American vernacular music like jazz, along with ethnic and ancient musics. For his piece Different Trains, released in 1988, Reich integrated fragments of audio recordings pertaining to rail travel, including the reminiscences of Holocaust survivors, with a string quartet that mimicked the rhythm of the train and natural musicality of the voices on the tape. This piece, performed by the Kronos Quartet, won a Grammy Award for Best Contemporary Composition in 1989. The work as a whole is about 30 minutes long, but even within the following short clip, you will be able to hear the minimalism within Reich's work. The underlying rhythms get repeated over and over again, transferring among each player, changing ever so slightly as the work progresses. You can hear the tension Reich created, which directly correlates with the mood of the piece.
And he said, don't breathe. And he said, don't breathe. And he was trying to work it. And he was trying to work it. For 4 days before night. For 4 days before night. And then we went through these soul-sounding names. Soul-sounding. And then we went through these soul-sounding names. Polish. Polish news. Lots of cattle wagons there. Lots of cattle wagons. Lots of cattle wagons there. They were loaded with people. They were loaded with people. They showed.
Even though there is so much more to discuss, we hope that this video was able to provide you with a better insight of music from the 20th century and that you now know a little more than before about Igor Stravinsky, Arnold Schoenberg, John Cage, and Steve Reich.